On the first Monday of April 1987, the Sawmill outside Allegany County, New York, dumped another truckload of rough maple slabs onto the edge of neglected pasture owned by 71-year-old Ruth Callahan. The foreman barely looked at her as the load crashed onto the muddy ground. To him, they were nothing more than waste left over after the finest boards had been cut and shipped to furniture factories across Pennsylvania. To Ruth, every twisted slab carried the shape of a tree that had stood through winters older than she was. She rested one weathered hand on her fence post, watched the truck disappear in a cloud of dust, and quietly said, "Wood remembers who bothers to listen." People in Allegany County knew Ruth as the widow who refused to sell her family's 80-acre farm after her husband, Harold, died in November 1982. The dairy barn had grown quiet. The Holsteins were gone. The cornfields were rented to a neighboring farmer. Many assumed she survived only because her expenses had become smaller than her dreams. They were wrong. Let me tell you about Ruth Callahan before anyone called her successful. She had spent 46 years working beside Harold, rarely speaking more than necessary. Her hands carried thin white scars from stacking firewood, repairing fences, and sharpening draw knives. Her boots always looked older than the calendar. She walked slowly, not because she lacked strength, but because she believed hurried people miss important things. Her blue eyes studied every board, every nail, every hinge before making a decision. Behind the aging machine she had rested the one possession she valued almost as much as the farmhouse itself. It was a 1951 Oliver 88 row crop tractor, rated at approximately 48 bell horsepower and weighing nearly 5,000 pounds. Harold had bought it brand new from a dealer in Belmont, New York, for about $2,300 after saving through 8 difficult seasons. The tractor had planted hay, pulled wagons, hauled maple logs, and even carried both of their children in its steel seat when they were too small to reach the pedals. Harold believed machinery deserved clean oil before fresh paint. Ruth never forgot that lesson. Every spring since his passing, she started the Oliver, let the engine idle until warm, and drove one slow lap around the property. She claimed the tractor sounded lonely if left silent too long. The sawmill manager, however, saw only an old widow with empty land. Each week his crews hauled away rough maple slabs too irregular for commercial lumber. Disposal cost money. Dumping them on roofs and used pasture cost nothing. She accepted because the company promised to level the piles once a year. They rarely did. By late May, the heap stood taller than the split-rail fence. Neighbors shook their heads. "What are you going to do with all that junk?" one asked. Ruth smiled. "I haven't asked it yet." The answer puzzled everyone. Across town, 34-year-old Ethan Mercer had recently become vice president of Mercer Community Bank. College-educated, sharply dressed, and confident in modern business methods, Ethan believed rural properties survived only by adapting quickly or selling before losses grew larger. He admired efficiency. Numbers comforted him. Sentiment did not. When he reviewed Ruth's modest operating loan that June, he frowned. Minimal farm income, unused acreage, a tractor nearly 4 decades old, stacks of discarded wood. He requested a visit, driving onto property in a polished pickup. Ethan climbed out carrying a clipboard instead of gloves. "You've got enough scrap wood here to build a mountain," he joked. Ruth nodded. "Mountains become useful if you know where to stand." Ethan smiled politely without understanding. "Let me tell you about maple slabs, because they fool almost everyone the first time they see them. When a sawmill cuts a log into straight boards, the rounded outer edges are removed first. Those curved pieces, called slabs, still contain strong hardwood beneath the bark. Furniture factories usually reject them because their irregular shape slows production. Large manufacturers earn money through speed and uniformity, not patience. Yet hidden inside many slabs lies clear maple with remarkable grain, waiting for someone willing to shape it by hand instead of machine. Most people saw firewood. Ruth saw possibilities. Ethan walked through the piles, poking at them with the tip of his polished shoe. "You'll never turn this into income." She simply replied, "We'll see." Before leaving, Ethan reminded her that the operating loan came up for renewal in September. "I'd recommend thinking about selling part of the property." "I'll think," Ruth answered. He drove away, convinced she would eventually agree. That evening, Ruth uncovered Harold's old woodworking tools from a cabinet untouched in years. Hand planes, spokeshaves, chisels polished smooth by decades of honest work. Beneath them lay a folded notebook filled with measurements for tables, benches, and cabinets Harold had once hoped to build after retiring from dairy farming. She sat quietly until sunset, turning each page without speaking. Outside, the Oliver 88 rested beneath its faded shed roof. Beyond it, thousands of discarded maple slabs waited beneath the evening sky. And before the week was over, the entire county would hear laughter that neither Ruth nor Ethan would ever forget. The laughter began on Friday, June 19, 1987, inside the loading yard of Hammond Sawmill, just outside Wellsville in Allegany County, New York. Ruth Callahan had driven her faded 1951 Oliver 88 row crop to the front gate with a homemade oak wagon rattling behind it. She intended to collect another load of maple slabs before an afternoon thunderstorm rolled across the valley. The tractor's steady six-cylinder engine echoed between towering stacks of fresh-cut hardwood, drawing curious glances from workers who had grown accustomed to newer diesel loaders and hydraulic equipment. Ethan Mercer happened to be there that morning. Mercer Community Bank had recently financed a new debarking system for mill, and Ethan was touring the facility with its owner, Charles Hammond, a confident 42-year-old businessman who believed efficiency solved almost every problem. Charles spotted Ruth steering toward another pile of discarded slabs. He stopped walking, folded his arms, then laughed. "There goes the queen of firewood," he announced loudly enough for everyone in the yard to hear. "You know, Miss Callahan, someday you'll realize you're hauling garbage instead of lumber." Several workers laughed with him. One leaned against a forklift. Another shook his head while wiping sawdust from his gloves. Even Ethan smiled, not because he disliked Ruth, because the scene genuinely seemed impossible. A 71-year-old widow collecting industrial waste with a tractor built before most of the younger employees had even been born. Charles called out again, "If you build yourself a mansion from those scraps, save me the biggest room." The laughter grew louder. It rolled across the yard like loose boards sliding from a truck. Everyone waited to see how Ruth would respond. She shut off the Oliver, climbed down slowly, brushed the dust from her work gloves, looked directly at Charles, then said almost gently, "I won't build a mansion." She paused. "I'll build something your grandchildren will still be using." The laughter stopped, not because anyone believed her, because she sounded like someone describing tomorrow's weather instead of making a prediction. Without another word, Ruth picked up the first slab, then another, then another. She ignored the twisted bark and rough edges. Her eyes searched only for the hidden grain beneath. Ethan watched her for several minutes before walking closer. "You honestly think people pay good money for furniture made from sawmill waste?" Ruth smiled without looking up. "I think people pay for beauty." He frowned. "But that's waste." "No," she replied quietly. "That's unfinished maple." The difference was only 2 words. Yet Ethan couldn't stop thinking about them. The Oliver pulled away under another heavy load, its familiar engine settling into the calm rhythm Harold had once called the sound of honest work. Long after the tractor disappeared around the bend, Ethan remained standing in the yard. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt as though he had missed something important. Let me tell you about Harold Callahan's workshop. It stood behind the farmhouse beneath a weathered tin roof installed during the summer of 1963. The building measured just 24 feet long and 20 feet wide, but every inch had a purpose. Shelves held hand planes arranged by size. Chisels rested inside homemade walnut racks. Old coffee cans overflowed with square nails sorted by length. The smell inside never changed: maple shavings, linseed oil, beeswax, and cast iron warmed by afternoon sunlight. Harold had built furniture only during the winter months, when snow covered the fields and dairy work slowed. He never advertised. Neighbors simply knew that if they needed a table capable of lasting 50 years, Harold would quietly build one. After his death, Ruth closed the workshop door. For nearly 5 years, nothing moved inside except dust drifting through sunlight. Now she unlocked it again. The first week she cleaned every window. The second week she sharpened every blade. The third week she repaired Harold's old Delta bandsaw, replacing the cracked leather drive belt with one she stitched herself. Only then did she bring in the first maple slab. She laid it across the heavy workbench Harold had built in 1958. The bark came off first, then loose fibers. Then rough saw marks disappeared beneath the long strokes of a hand plane. Slowly, the wood revealed itself. Cream-colored maple, golden streaks, gentle waves of curly grain hidden beneath years of neglect. Ruth smiled. The slab everyone else had called worthless looked like something that belonged in a museum. Some people inherit money. Others inherit patience. Ruth inherited both Harold's skill and his belief that nothing made by nature should be wasted before it had the chance to become useful. Her first project was a farmhouse bench, 5 feet long, 2 inches thick, built with additional mortise and tenon joinery, secured by solid maple pegs instead of screws. She sanded it entirely by hand, finished it with boiled linseed oil. No stain, no glossy varnish, only the natural color of 80-year-old maple. When evening sunlight reached the porch, the grain seemed almost alive. 2 days later, her neighbor, Martha Collins, stopped by with a basket of fresh strawberries. She noticed the bench immediately. "Did you buy that?" Ruth smiled. "I built it." Martha ran her fingers across the smooth surface. "I've never seen maple look like this. It always looked like this. We just finally uncovered it." Martha purchased a bench for $185 before leaving the farm. That single sale paid for sandpaper, oil, hardware, and enough groceries to last several weeks. More importantly, it proved something Ruth had believed from the beginning. The wood had value. It simply needed someone patient enough to reveal it. During July, she completed 3 coffee tables, 2 console tables, 1 writing desk. Each piece looked different because every slab carried its own natural shape. She refused to straighten live edges. "The tree spent 70 years growing that curve," she often said. "I'm not removing it in 70 seconds." Have you ever owned something everyone else dismissed as worthless until they saw what it could become? Maybe it was an old pickup truck, a family farm, a worn-out tool, or perhaps it was a dream that made no sense to anyone except you. Sometimes the greatest challenge isn't creating value. It's believing in it long enough for everyone else to finally notice. By early August, every piece Ruth finished had already been sold. Word spread quietly through Allegany County. Customers weren't buying furniture because it was fashionable. They were buying craftsmanship that could no longer be found in factory showrooms. Meanwhile, Ethan Mercer sat behind his desk, reviewing monthly loan reports. One account caught his attention. Ruth Callahan. Small deposits appeared almost every week. $185, $320, $510, then $700. The totals weren't enormous, but they were steady. Steadier than many commercial businesses he financed. Curiosity slowly replaced certainty. On the last Thursday of August, Ethan drove back to the Callahan farm without calling ahead. He expected to find one elderly woman building a few hobby projects. Instead, he found 4 pickup trucks parked beside the workshop, customers waiting patiently on the porch, fresh maple shavings covering the floor, and Ruth smiling quietly as another family carried a handcrafted table toward their truck. At that very moment, a familiar green Oliver 88 rolled into the yard with another wagon full of discarded maple slabs. This time, someone unexpected was sitting beside Ruth on the tractor seat. The man climbing down from the Oliver 88 was Charles Hammond. Only 10 weeks earlier, he had laughed the loudest in the Sawmill yard. Now he stood beside the tractor with his cap in his hands instead of on his head. The confident grin that had once followed him everywhere was gone. In its place was something quieter. Respect. Ruth shut off the tractor, and the old 6-cylinder engine settled into silence. Customers waiting outside the workshop looked from Charles to Ruth, wondering why the owner of the largest sawmill in Allegany County had arrived riding on the same machine he had mocked. Ethan Mercer stepped from his pickup just in time to hear Charles speak. "I came to apologize." Nobody said a word. The only sound came from a light breeze moving through the maple trees behind the barn. Charles cleared his throat. "I laughed because I thought those slabs were worthless. I was wrong." Ruth looked at him for several seconds before smiling. "You weren't wrong about the slabs." Charles blinked. You were wrong about the person carrying them. The words landed harder than any argument, not because they were loud, because they were true. Charles nodded slowly. I suppose I was. He reached into his truck and carried out a folded document. I've got a proposal. Inside the papers was a simple agreement. Instead of paying disposal companies to haul away maple slabs, Charles wanted Ruth to take every usable slab the mill produced. No dumping fee, no hauling charge. The mill would even stack the best pieces separately for her. He had done the math. The arrangement would save his business nearly $18,000 each year in disposal costs. Ruth studied the papers carefully. She did not rush. She never did. Finally, she looked up. I'll accept. Charles smiled. But one condition. He waited. No special piles. He frowned. What do you mean? I want exactly what everyone else throws away. Charles stared at her. Why? Because if your workers start choosing the pretty pieces, they'll stop seeing value in the rest. He laughed softly, not the mocking laugh from June, a different laugh, one filled with admiration. You've taught me something today. Let me tell you about figured maple. Most maple trees produce straight, even grain, perfect for flooring and cabinets. Every so often, nature creates something unusual. Tiny changes in a tree's growth cause the fibers to ripple like water. Woodworkers call it curly maple or fiddleback maple because early violin makers treasured it. The remarkable part is this. From the outside, you often cannot tell the difference. A plain-looking log may hide spectacular grain beneath its bark. That is why experienced sawyers never judge timber before the first cut. People, Ruth believed, deserved the same patience. By October 1987, her workshop operated 6 days a week. She hired her first employee. His name was Daniel Foster, 23 years old, recently laid off from a cabinet factory that had replaced hand craftsmanship with automated machinery. Daniel expected Ruth to teach him woodworking. Instead, she taught him observation. Don't cut until you know what the board wants. He looked puzzled. The board doesn't want anything. She smiled. Listen longer. Months later, he admitted she had been right. Each slab suggested its own shape. Some became benches. Others became dining tables. Some waited for years before revealing their purpose. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan returned carrying a leather briefcase instead of loan documents. I'd like to order a dining table. Ruth looked surprised. For yourself? For my parents. She nodded. What size? Whatever the wood decides. She smiled wider than usual. You've been paying attention. While Daniel selected slabs, Ethan wandered toward the Oliver Park beside the shed. Its faded green paint had worn thin around the fenders. The steering wheel showed smooth patches where Harold's hands had rested for decades. The hour meter had stopped years earlier. Yet, the tractor still started every morning. Still hauled heavy loads. Still worked without complaint. Have you ever known you were right when everyone around you insisted you were wrong? Think about that for a moment. Most people give up long before they discover whether they were actually correct, not because they lacked ability, but because constant doubt grows heavy. Ruth understood something many never learn. Confidence does not have to be loud. Sometimes the strongest certainty arrives quietly, puts on worn boots, starts an old engine, and goes back to work. Late that autumn, a reporter from the Wellsville Daily Reporter visited the farm after hearing rumors about furniture made from discarded lumber. The article appeared on November 14, 1987. Its headline read, Widow turns sawmill waste into fine furniture. Orders arrived from Buffalo, then Rochester, then Syracuse. Customers waited 3 months, then 6. No one complained. Every piece carried a small brass plate underneath, crafted from reclaimed New York maple by Ruth Callahan. Nothing more. No fancy logo. No marketing slogan. Just the truth. Ethan reviewed the year's financial statements one last time before Christmas. He leaned back in his chair, almost laughing at himself. When he first visited the farm, he had seen declining assets. Today he saw something entirely different. A growing business with almost no advertising, virtually free raw materials. no inventory sitting unsold, and demand increasing faster than production. He drove to the farm the following morning carrying revised loan papers. This time there would be no suggestion of selling land. Instead, he offered financing to expand the workshop if she ever wanted it. Ruth thanked him, then quietly slid the papers back across the table. "I appreciate it, but I don't want the business to grow faster than my hands." Ethan nodded slowly. For the first time since meeting her, he understood exactly what she meant. Outside, snow began falling across the pasture, where fresh maple slabs waited beneath white blankets. Neither Ruth nor Ethan noticed the unfamiliar black sedan turning into the driveway. The man behind us will had traveled more than 300 miles, and what he offered next would change the future of the farm forever. The black sedan stopped beside the workshop, just as the first heavy snow settled across the maple pasture. The man behind the wheel introduced himself as Richard Ellison, a furniture gallery owner from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Earlier that week, he had read the newspaper article about Ruth Callahan transforming discarded maple slabs into handcrafted furniture. He had driven more than 300 miles because he wanted to see whether the story was exaggerated. It wasn't. Richard walked slowly through the workshop, saying almost nothing. He examined every joint, every hand-planed edge, every natural curve Ruth had preserved instead of cutting away. When he reached a large dining table resting near the back wall, he placed both hands on its surface and simply smiled. "I've been buying furniture for 26 years, he said. "Most craftsmen try to make what look perfect. You let the wood remember where it came from." Ruth nodded. "It already knows." Richard looked at her. "So do you." Before leaving, he placed a leather folder on the workbench. Inside was an order unlike anything Ruth had ever imagined. 12 custom dining tables, 24 matching benches, 8 executive desks. Delivery over the next 18 months. Total contract value, $118,600. For a moment, nobody spoke. Daniel stared at the papers. Ethan removed his glasses and read the figures again. Charles Hammond quietly whistled under his breath. Ruth simply folded the contract closed. "I'll build them." Richard laughed softly. "You haven't even asked about the deposit." "I don't need to." "You trust me?" "I trust people who shake hands before they talk about money." Richard extended his hand. She shook it. That single handshake changed the future of the Callahan farm. "Let me tell you about why old workshops often outperform modern factories when craftsmanship matters most. Horsepower determines how fast a machine can perform work, but torque determines how strongly it keeps moving when the load becomes difficult. Older cast-iron machinery, driven at lower speeds, often produced steady torque without placing extreme stress on the components. That meant smoother cuts, less vibration, and better control in skilled hands. Modern production machines excel at speed and consistency, but hand-built furniture depends more on judgment than production rate. Ruth wasn't competing against factories. She was doing something factories weren't designed to do. She allowed every piece of wood to become an individual story instead of another identical product rolling down an assembly line. During 1988, the workshop expanded carefully, not quickly, never quickly. Ruth hired 2 additional craftsmen, but only after spending months teaching them how to read grain before touching a saw. "The tree tells you where to cut," she reminded them every morning. Some understood immediately. Others needed time. The Oliver 88 became the heart of the operation. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday it traveled to Charles Hammond's sawmill, returning with another wagon full of discarded maple slabs. Customers began asking whether the old tractor was part of the business. Daniel smiled. It always was. By autumn, magazines devoted to traditional woodworking featured Ruth's furniture. Collectors appreciated the natural edges. Families appreciated the strength. Every table carried the same brass plate beneath it, crafted from reclaimed New York maple by Ruth Callahan. Nothing more, because nothing more was necessary. Have you ever watched someone quietly succeed without trying to prove anyone wrong? Those victories often last the longest. The people who spend their lives arguing usually exhaust themselves. The people who keep working eventually let the results speak instead. 5 years passed. Then 10. By By 1997, the Callahan workshop employed 11 local craftsmen. Young apprentices arrived from across New York to learn hand-cut joinery instead of automated production. Daniel Foster became the workshop foreman, but he still introduced himself simply as one of Ruth's students. Charles Hammond never again referred to maple slabs as waste. The sawmill changed its own policies, separating usable hardwood for local craftsmen instead of sending it to landfills. Whenever new employees asked why, Charles told them the story of the quiet widow who had taught him the true difference between cost and value. Ethan Mercer remained at Mercer Community Bank. Years later, whenever young loan officers judged farmers only by balance sheets, he would point toward Ruth's file. Never mistake today's numbers for tomorrow's possibilities. He meant every word. On a warm September afternoon in 2003, Ruth drove the Oliver 88 around the farm one final time. The tractor still started on the first pull of the starter. Its paint had faded even further. Its seat had been repaired twice. Its engine still sounded exactly the way Harold remembered. She parked it beneath the same shed where it had rested for more than half a century. Daniel found her there, sitting quietly with one hand on the steering wheel. "I think she's earned a day's rest," Ruth said. "The tractor?" "No." She smiled. "I have." Ruth Callahan passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 months later at the age of 87. She left the farm, the workshop, and the Oliver 88 to the craftsmen who had become her extended family. Daniel refused every offer to replace the old tractor. "It hauled the first slab," he would say. "It'll haul the last." Today, visitors to the workshop still see that 1951 Oliver 88 parked beside stacks of maple waiting for their turn. Some of the original benches Ruth built in 1987 remain in the homes of the families who bought them. Their surfaces carry scratches from children doing homework, holiday dinners, birthday cakes, and ordinary evenings that quietly became memories. The wood never stopped working. Neither did the lesson she left behind. Some things don't become valuable because the world finally notices them. They become valuable because someone refuses to stop seeing what everyone else overlooked. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly built a life from what others threw away, I'd truly love to hear about them in the comments. Maybe it was a parent, a grandparent, a neighbor, or even you. Those stories deserve to be remembered just as much as this one. And if you'd like to hear about the Kentucky farmer who rescued a forgotten steam engine from a flooded creek and unknowingly preserved a piece of American agricultural history, I hope you'll join me for that story too. Some machines carry more than power. They carry the people who believed in them.